o'clock, and welcome to our Region 3 Town Hall. And just to start off the meeting, obviously we would have wanted to see everybody in person. It's good to see everybody out there, either your face or your name. A lot of very familiar people I see, and some names I know, but maybe I have not met. And we are excited to share this virtual town hall with you. As I was mentioning before, we would have wanted to see everybody in person. Our plan was to, in the beginning of the year, is to do our tour where we take our executive board and we go through the state and meet with all of the locals in the regions and share this dialogue with you in person. But we felt that the dialogue and the information is so important that we wanted to have these virtual meetings with you and to continue this dialogue in 2020. I'm going to leave it to Mike Lunati to lead us in our dialogue. He will set the ground rules so we all can communicate well. And before I turn it over to Mike, this year has brought us a lot of challenges, and I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Mike Lunati and his staff at the association guiding us, making sure that we were always well represented in Albany. His level of communication was second to none. And I'm so very proud to be working alongside Mike and our executive board. And without further ado, Mike Lunati.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning, everybody. Welcome, as another welcome to echo Bill's comments. We're glad to have you with us this morning. What we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through some information, but the majority of our time is going to be spent really having a conversation. So we can stay on the call as long as we need to. We have no time constraints. We just want to make sure that we're getting as much feedback and hearing from our members on the topics that we're going to talk about this morning. So for the most part, I think most of you have already muted yourselves. I don't think we're going to have to worry about background noise, but if we start to hear any, just to let you know, I will mute everyone if needed. I also want to let you know that the town halls are being recorded. So anybody who is unable to join us this morning, we'll have an opportunity later on to listen in to the conversation from the region. So let me try this here. I'm going to try to share my screen with you to have you get a look at the PowerPoint presentation. All right. So before we begin, I just wanted to take a moment to thank our sponsors who, thanks to their generosity, has helped us underwrite our town halls here today. As I mentioned, we're going to go through and talk about a couple of topics. So we have two topics on the agenda today. The first is what we're dubbing paraprofessionals, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. And also we want to talk to you about alcohol in funeral homes. So I will give you a brief overview, a couple minutes to give you the information that we have worked on thus far and that we've gathered. And then, as I mentioned, the majority of the time will be sent in discussion mode. In terms of discussion, there's two ways that you can let us know what you're thinking. You can either unmute yourself and speak to provide those comments and questions. If you are muted, you also have the option of raising your hand, in which case I can recognize you. So we have a pretty small group though today, so small enough that we should be able to manage without that. But if needed, we can do it that way. And then also there's a chat feature at the bottom of your screen. So you can also type in your comments or questions and I will read those out and we can do it that way as well. So those are your two options. As I mentioned, the goal is member feedback. We are holding town halls in each of our regions across the state. We held our first two yesterday, and we are going to complete them by middle of the week next week. As I said, all of them are being recorded, so they will all be available at the conclusion of all the town halls. Once we collect all the information from our members, we here will consolidate all the feedback and present it to the board at their December meeting. I will think it's very important for everyone to know that at this point in time, there is no desired outcome, no defined next steps or specific plans as to either of these topics. The association has taken no position on any of the issues that we're about to discuss, nor has there been legislation researched or drafted at this point in time. So I think it would be helpful because it has been going on for these conversations for quite a while, to give you the full picture of what we're talking about. So I'd like to just kind of walk through the chronology of these conversations to help kind of put a frame around our conversation today. So these conversations really started back in 2015. Now, back in 15, the conversations were not specifically about paraprofessionals. However, it's always been part of the bigger funeral service workforce issues, which have been on the radar since then. So the first group to look at this was the Funeral Service Education Task Force. Their goal, as you can see on the screen, was to strengthen and elevate funeral service now and for the future. And they focused their concentration in areas of residency, education and curriculum at the mortuary science colleges, continuing education, and master certification. After their 2 years of work, they came out with some recommendations, which I've shown you on the screen here. With regard to residency, they suggested adding a discernment period and providing increased accountability and structure around the residency program. Just as a side note, that issue has now reached the legislative drafting phase. We have drafted legislation that we are ready to introduce into the state legislature to address that issue. So just to let you know that that process is ongoing. With regard to education and curriculum, they had suggested a new proposed curriculum for the mortuary science programs. And with regard to continuing education and master certification, they had recommended a new mandatory credentialing program and higher quality continuing education program review and approval. So those things are ongoing, but again, it was really focused in the area of residency and really looking a lot at the mortuary science college programs at that time. Following their work in 2018, the association president appointed the Funeral Service 2020 Task Force, which worked for the 2018 to 2019 time period. The goal of the task force was to explore and implement new programs to ensure a bright future for funeral service in New York State. So as you can see, a lot of similarities to the work overall goal of the Funeral Service Education Task Force. So in a lot of ways, the Funeral Service 2020 Task Force was really extending or expanding upon the beginning works of the Education Task Force. The Funeral Service 2020 Task Force focused in the areas of recruitment, residency, professional development, mentors, and paraprofessionals. And what I like to say is that they took a really holistic approach to looking at the workforce issues. And you can see that by that circle graph that's there. They were looking at the workforce in terms of the quality of the workforce and the quantity. So there have been concerns expressed about the numbers coming into funeral service because of low enrollment and low graduation numbers from the programs. And the quality wasn't so much about the existing funeral service professionals, but the quality of those who are recruiting to come into the profession. So you can see it really started with what we called pre-students, which were high school students, and finding ways to provide tools to school counselors who would be able to point certain individuals towards funeral service if it seemed like it'd be a good fit for them. And we do have a program. It's called Want to Be a Funeral Director or a Career in Funeral Service. And we have a lot of tools available that we have been sharing in the hopes of trying to create some more awareness with regard to that. So you can see that this is worked all the way from that region, or that aspect, all the way through retirees. With regard to recommendations that were presented in June of 2019 from the task force, they gave recommendations in each of the 5 focus areas and suggested having a combination of work groups, task forces, and our Bridge Commission tackle different areas of focus. With regard to paraprofessionals, their recommendation was to create a task force to continue the work that they had started. When they presented that to the association board desired to get additional member input first. The original plan with regard to that was to gather the input during the 2020 regional meetings. However, as we all know, COVID disrupted that plan and caused us to cancel those meetings. And those have been replaced by these town halls. So now, just diving into it a little bit more closely into the recommendation of the task force. In arriving at their recommendations, the task force divided itself into several work groups, and they took a deep dive into each focus area. That deep dive with regard to the topic of paraprofessionals was done through a specific exercise that I want to work you through now. The group was presented with an assumption scenario and asked to answer questions, or maybe you want to say address a specific question. And that assumption scenario was, as you can see here, we presented them with a hypothetical that said, assume the association had received notice from the Department of Health that due to the extremely low numbers of licensed funeral directors in New York State, that the department had declared this a public health issue. Assume that the department is proposing a new license or certification be developed to address the workforce need in funeral service due to the lack of licensed funeral directors, and a determination that addressing this issue through additional newly licensed funeral directors is not feasible at this point. What would the ideal job description and responsibilities be? So again, we kind of took the assumption based on the feedback we had been getting from our members and these other groups that have been working, that there wasn't a potential concern with regard to quality and quantity of the workforce. So we said, okay, let's take it to the next step and actually try to address it, assuming it became a reality. So the first step in answering that question was really exploring, the why and coming up with a list of what should be addressed. So to say that maybe a little differently, based on the assumption scenario, why is there a lack of funeral directors, and what needs to be accounted for when creating these new positions? And the group's answers are included in the list that you can see on your screen. It was to spark a career interest in funeral service, to create a pool of qualified and trained funeral workers, protect families who you're working with by ensuring that the people they're working with are vetted and certified professionals, counteract the shortage of licensed funeral directors, licensed funeral directors because of low enrollment in the mortuary science programs, to better serve families' needs, to respond to funerals being more involved and requiring more event planning and similar services, to provide an option for smaller funeral homes who might not have the resources to be able to hire another licensed funeral director, to help owners and managers by relieving front and back office house operations, supplement the availability of funeral service professionals, enhance the role of the licensed funeral director because they would be the supervisor in those cases, making the license more valuable, and then to prevent burnout of licensed funeral directors. So once that group had come up with that list and basically answered the why and the what, then they moved on to answering the how. And the how was really phrased in a way of saying, well, okay, how are we going to deal with this, or what new positions can we consider? So the group explored two positions. They explored what we're dubbing the certified funeral assistant and the certified funeral arranger. And I want to point out the word explored there again, because I want to reinforce again that the task force recommendation was to form another task force to continue their work on the topic. They did not recommend creating any specific positions. However, they did put a lot of time, thought, and discussion towards these positions. So I want to share it with you to give us a place from which to further our discussion today and to provide a reference point for your feedback. So I'm going to walk you through now the two positions in terms of proposed duties and some of the certification requirements. So the framework regarding certified funeral assistant was really intended to be very similar to what you might see in the dental field or the legal field. So you have dental hygienists who help dentists, you have paralegals who help attorneys. Somebody in one of the other calls also mentioned the nursing field where you have that same structure there. And the duties that they talked about and the requirements would be that a certified funeral assistant would have to work under the direct supervision of a licensed funeral director. That person could only work for one funeral home at a time. The duties would include their ability to sign out and transfer the deceased from place of death. They could also assist the licensed director with preparation, dressing, and casketing. However, they would not be allowed to transport a decedent to the place of final disposition over the concerns that you can see there. They would not be allowed to direct or supervise a service. They would not be allowed to sign or amend death certificates, embalm, or conduct arrangements. The arrangements would be looked at in that second position, that the certified arranger, which we'll go over in just a moment. With regard to the training requirements, the proposal was 8 to 12 hour pre-certification program, and then ultimately passing a state recognized exam. The certification would be one issued by the Department of Health, the State Department of Health. They would have to recertify every 2 years, just like you guys do today. They suggested 4 credit hours every biennium, and it suggested requiring OSHA and ethics. Again, so that was the initial framework and some of the ideas that came out of that work group as it relates to certified funeral assistants. Turning over and looking at the certified funeral arranger, similar to the assistant, you would have to be working under the direct supervision of a licensed funeral director. You would only be able to be employed by one funeral home at a time. Obviously, this person would be focused on making arrangements both at need and pre-need. They would be able to collect vital information, coordinate and schedule final disposition, arrange for the care, preparation, and transportation of the decedent, and discuss and sell merchandise and services. They would not be allowed to sign contracts, sign or amend death certificates, or embalm. With regard to the certification requirements, the framework included a 20-hour pre-certification training program that would include 25 hands-on arrangements under the direct supervision of the funeral director, and also an overview of the embalming process. Like the assistant position, they would have to pass a state-recognized exam. Certification would be issued by the State Department of Health, recertification every 2 years. They suggested also requiring ethics for this position. With regard to the other topics and number of credit hours, those were still to be determined. So that's the framework for those two positions that were discussed and vetted by the work group, and ultimately part of what would be carried forward and presented to any group that might continue this conversation. Now, as the work group or the task force was getting close to presenting their recommendations to the board, which was done in June of 2019, they asked for one additional data point, and that was member feedback. So in May of 2019, we did a member survey with regard to these particular issues to see where the membership stood at that point in time. It's been a year, and we did share this when it was done, but we thought it was important to share with you again at this time. So here, just to show you some of the demographics, it was just 230, well, just under 240, so 239 funeral directors answered this survey. You can see the breakdown of who they were in terms of being an owner, a manager, or a licensed funeral director on staff. So you can see a decent split amongst the different respondents. So a couple of the questions that we asked with regard to this were, has your funeral home experienced a shortage of qualified licensed funeral directors available for hire? And you can see the split there, just under 44% saying yes, just under 30 saying no, and other 26% saying they haven't needed to hire anyone recently. We also asked them if they had concerns about the future workforce for funeral service in New York State. And as you can see there, 76% said yes, 13 no, and just under 10.5 said they hadn't really thought about it enough. So clearly 3/4 of the members who responded did have some concerns about the future of funeral service. We had provided them some background information about the paraprofessional discussion and those two positions. So we asked them a couple of questions about those as well. So having seen what we had been working on, we asked if they felt we should continue to explore the topic of revising the license structure for funeral service professionals. You can see just about half, just under 50% said yes. Another 40 said no. And that same, I'm guessing those same folks who hadn't really thought about it responded. So just under 11% were unsure. So just about half said they felt we should continue to look at this. Looking at those two positions that we just went over, we asked if they believed we should continue exploring the funeral assistant position. 52% said yes, 37% no, and that 11% unsure. Looking at the arranger position, 35% felt we should continue on, 55% or just under 55% said they did not feel we should go on, and then there's that same 10-11% that were unsure. So as you can see, there's a pretty significant split, there's a split almost 50-50 if you throw the unsures into either of the categories. So there was definitely an interest in continuing to explore this. Again, nothing more than exploring it further was asked at that point in time. So that's the information that we had collected to date with regard to the paraprofessional positions. Before we open it up for discussion, I just want to give you the information that we have about the alcohol and funeral homes. This is not as in-depth, and that's really because it's a lot newer process. This was seen or is being looked at as an expansion of the food and beverage law. The initial time this was raised was during last year's Governmental Affairs Committee meeting, which was December of 2019. It came up in the context of offering a champagne toast or something similar in honor of a deceased, because as you all know, under the law now, alcohol is prohibited, so something like a toast would not be allowed. So that was something that was brought up there, but to date, no further action, due diligence has been conducted, but it was an opportunity for us to ask some questions about that now of your members during the town hall. So we wanted to add it to the topics that we would discuss. So that's the information that we wanted to share with you. As I mentioned, the majority of our time I wanted to spend having that open discussion, hearing from you, comments, questions. If you like certain things that you've seen, if you think there's different ways we should be exploring it. So I am going to now just turn it over to the group and offer you the opportunity to provide us your feedback. So again, you can unmute yourself to speak. If you'd like to raise your hand instead or type something in, just let me know and I will be monitoring that. So without further ado, please let us know what you think.
So Mike, just to clarify here, so the task force for the paraprofessionals is looking for a separate task force to, I guess, build upon it, correct?
Correct. So the funeral service 2020 task force was, its lifespan was the presidency for that year. So that was an August to August task force. So their work was done and they presented their recommendation. So we talked about it in terms of residency, recruitment, mentorship, paraprofessionals. There were 5 categories, and their recommendation to the board was, we believe there should be either work groups formed, a task force formed, or use the Bridge Commission to explore these topics further. And in the area of paraprofessionals, that's what they suggested, was another task force be formed to continue their work in exploring the possibility. And that has not been done yet, because the hope was that we would have had these conversations back in April, and then we would have gone back to the board and looked to see what we were going to do next. But again, everything was pushed back because of the pandemic. Obviously, had we done the regional meetings in April because there was no pandemic, we also wouldn't have the actual experience that our members had with the deputized agents, which in some ways is similar to the certified positions. So there's a different tone or aspect to the conversation that we wouldn't have otherwise had, which might help us and has been brought up and discussed in some of the other town halls as well. I see we have a question from Paul Decker on the survey, asking if the survey was weighted. No, the survey was not weighted. It was just sent out. We send it out to the main contact at each of our member firms the same way we would when we do the voting. So it wasn't weighted. Every member has 1 vote. So that's how we did the survey. We do all our surveys the same way, just for consistency purposes.
On the topic of alcohol in the funeral home, so I guess the question is more or less being able to have a toast rather than, actually serving alcohol in the funeral home, correct?
So again, the conversation was brought up, or the idea was brought up in the context of a toast, but no further discussions have taken place. So whether that is something that ultimately is decided to go forward or not is still on the table. If it is a go forward, what form does that take? Is it only toast? Are there restrictions built around it? So none of that has been discussed, which is why we want to make sure that we're talking to our members to get feedback, so we know which direction we might want to go in terms of further conversations. Right. So anybody who has an opinion about that now, that's what we're trying to do, is gather folks' opinions on both of those topics.
Right. Legally, what does that present us with, like a liquor license?
Yeah, so we haven't explored it yet, but whether, if they're using a caterer like you do with food and beverage, they would obviously, if they're coming in, have to have a license. Whether the premises would have to have a license or a permit to allow serving of alcohol on the premises would have to be explored. What that would mean. Somebody else brought up, just making sure your insurance coverages are there to protect from additional potential liability and those kind of things. But again, very early stages. All of those kind of questions would have to be fleshed out as we moved along.
So Ed, I'll provide you some background as well. So where we are right now throughout our nation is that 49 of the 50 states allow for food and basic beverage in the funeral home. 46 out of the 50 states allow for consumption of alcohol. And that is either included in their specific legislation for funeral homes, or where there's no legislation that exists, the funeral home goes through the process of securing the necessary permits in their specific state. And, that keeping that in mind, if there were, I guess, concerns, we would have heard them already throughout in the news. And so that's some of the discussion that, many people have had in the background. And I think that the concept is not about opening a bar in the funeral home and having, multiple hours of drinking, but the ability and what we've realized is that there's many families that enjoyed having the food in the funeral home, and they'd say, well, it'd be nice if we could have a champagne toast, or we could have a glass of wine with our meal, or maybe a bottle of beer. So we're not looking to bring in hard alcohol. We're not looking to create bars. It's something, it kind of coincides with what we're already doing.
Great.
Anyone else? Feelings on either paraprofessionals, alcohol in the funeral home? Are you in favor of moving forward? Do you have any questions or about what was presented? Do you like or have questions about any of the specific work that was already done by the task force?
Question about the going forward on this task force for the paraprofessionals. How is that going to be, formed? How are you going to go about doing that?
So generally, the president of the association during their term always has the ability to form committees, form task force work groups. So the plan in this case was to have the board get the feedback from the regional meetings or the town halls. And then from there, assuming if there was a desire to continue exploring it, then the president would be able to appoint these work groups and task force. And then each president coming, if the work's not done, could continue that task force work or change it, do whatever they would like to do. So that's the plan. It would be board looks at the information and the feedback, and then the president of the association would make appointments of any groups to work on the issue going forward.
Mike, I certainly feel both are worthwhile pursuing and recommend we move forward. There's definitely a need for the paraprofessional, just based on the shortage of funeral directors, and creating a position that perhaps will draw more people to our profession and help with the shortage going forward. So I think it has a dual purpose. And certainly, I know from experience in talking to the funeral homes that the consumer is looking for alcohol to, enhance their luncheons and dinners they're having with us now. So I think that's worthwhile pursuing as well. Good call.
Thank you. I'm curious if anybody on the call deputized anybody during the pandemic when that was authorized, and what your experience was, if you did do that. If anybody be willing to share that experience.
I can speak about deputizing.
Sure, John.
We were in Brooklyn, which was a hot spot, and my hearse drive is going out to Calvert. It's a 5-mile trip to the cemetery. It takes about 2 hours. I deputized my hearse driver, and they were able to sign funerals in. Calverton was closed at the time, so families weren't attending. So the necessity of a funeral director going out to the cemetery when the deputy was available was cool. And as for making food, my daughter was with over 20 years. My brother Andrew has a disability with lifting sometimes, and Tommy was very helpful. If you would have asked me a year ago before COVID how I felt about them, I was probably negative. after seeing the practicality and the use for it, I'm on board with them.
Thank you.
That's my 50 cents.
Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone else on the call have experience with a deputized agent that they would like to share?
And like John, we were being in New York City. I'm on the call as one of the officers, but we deputized some folks. I guess we were very particular with deputizing a student who was in mortuary school who we deputized, and that worked out well. It was a wonderful experience for him. He was on staff already at the funeral home, so again, it really worked out. I'm definitely in favor of training, and I guess most of the folks on the call are owners, and you wouldn't have anyone on your staff that you wouldn't feel comfortable with anyway. So it's an extension of your funeral home. So again, I'm all in favor of the training, but see the need coming before.
Thank you, Bob.
My only
Mike,
concern is,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
Real quick, we weren't running limousines, so we deputized our limousine drivers to help out with transfers. So kept them working and obviously helped the operation.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. D'Arienzo.
I think it was Ed. Was that you were gonna?
Yes, yeah, it was me. My only concern about the deputizing, well, I guess a paraprofessional is devaluing our license. And I think that's something that we should really focus on moving forward of this.
Yep, and I can tell you that your colleagues on the previous calls, and then even prior to the town halls, when the issue was being discussed by the task force, one of the biggest cons, I'll call it, that they were, or cautionary pieces that they were concerned about was the devaluing of the license. And I know Bill Villanova has said it yesterday. He said it before that, the association is here to protect the licensed funeral directors. We're an association of our licensed members. So any final decision or any final structure that is approved would have to balance those two needs: the need for help against the value of the license, to make sure that you're not devaluing the license by adding and enhancing, because that's the goal. Is if you look at the goals of the task forces and that it worked before, it was secure the future of funeral service and make sure it was strong. So anything we would do would have to be following that same line. So again, details would have to be worked out. Conversations would have to take place. We're not there yet where we have a specific recommendation, but we have some framework and some groundwork that was done. So before we take any next steps, we want to make sure the membership's supportive of continuing to explore it. And if there are certain things that the membership wants us to focus on, be aware of, ensure that we are doing or aren't doing, that's going to help us in terms of how well we are able to have better focus the more feedback that we get.
Ed, I'm just going to share some information that, just through conversations over the past year. A paralegal does not devalue the attorney. Paramedical doesn't devalue the doctor, and so on and so forth. So, that's something that we keep in mind as well as we approach this. We're seeing this as a need, and some real-time information that we know as we're reviewing. And again, this discussion goes back to 2015. And some of the information that we're looking at is the number of students that are going into the mortuary science programs and the numbers that are graduating. So there's one attendee on yesterday's call who recently graduated from mortuary science program. And there were 40 students and only 6 graduated. And Region 1 conversation that we had at the town hall, one person said, if we have this abundance of funeral directors, why are there 17, and I think that was the number, Mike, 17 want ads in our state association magazine. So while it's not perfect yet, it's a discussion that's important for us to understand. The needs are different throughout our state, and something that may not benefit me or any of my colleagues down here in the metropolitan area, New York City area, could certainly benefit some of the funeral homes that are further north, where they're hurting, or they need that type of help. So that's the focus. And as Mike mentioned, and as I always say, is that our number one position is just to ensure that our license is fortified, and that we do everything we can to not only maintain it, but to enhance our license as well. And I think that that's equally important. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
And just to let folks know, David and Kathleen had also, I think they chatted next to everybody, so you might be able to see it yourself. But Ed, your comments about being careful about not devaluing the license, they both agreed with you. So again, you guys are not alone. That is obviously one of the biggest concerns that is out there, that anything we do going forward would not devalue the license. We have got that message loud and clear, and anybody who continues to work on this, the board will be advised of this. And as Bill said, the intention is never to devalue the license. So anything we present to the membership at the end of any process would be addressing that and look to balance that so that that would not happen. But thank you for sharing that, because it's obviously very important to a lot of people. Good for us to know.
Will a survey be done on, I guess, geographic locations on these two topics after the town hall meetings?
So generally, when we do we can do a statewide a survey, and then when we get feedback, we're able to break it down by region, just by the database or the system that we use. So we typically are doing that anyway, just to look, and we can hear from our members. We know where there is more interest or a need, I should say. And not surprisingly, some of the more rural areas have expressed a need for the paraprofessional position of the certified assistant. Obviously, like John DiArienzo pointed out, being in Brooklyn, that's clearly not a rural area, but the experience of the pandemic, shed a new light on something like that. So we will obviously dissect it to make sure that we're looking at it from all different angles to see if there's some different type of region, regions or areas of the state, population-based or otherwise, that might lean one way or the other more. But again, anything that the state association does, it would have to benefit or not hurt, however you want to look at it, the majority of our members statewide. We're not a local association, we're doing things for the betterment of the state of New York's funeral directors. So while it's important to have that information, the ultimate end product would have to be something that the majority of our statewide members are supportive of.
Yep.
Any other comments, questions, concerns, experiences?
I just want to record as well. I would never do anything to devalue my license or anybody else's. So again, as everybody's mentioned, we're just trying to look at different needs that might arise, even maybe not now, but down the road. So I just want to make that clear as well.
Right. Yeah, we are trying to look down the line and be prepared for what might lie ahead. Correct. So any other comments, experiences? And again, just to let you know also, and I mentioned this to the other groups, I will mention it to everybody, that we are looking at these town halls as the first next step in getting member feedback. So if it's something that you'd prefer to either send to me individually, if it's something that you haven't thought of or it comes to mind after we get off our call, I'd please encourage you to reach out to me to share that feedback, so I can make sure that we get it to the board. You can email me. My email address is mike@nysfda.org. So that's the easiest way to get your thoughts over to me, so that I can include it in any consolidation of feedback that we give to the board. So as I said, we have no time constraints one way or the other. So if there are no other comments or questions with regard to this topic, just before we sign off, I will also offer that if anybody has questions or or about anything else COVID related. We had a couple of those yesterday, or anything else going on that you'd like to ask of us since we have everyone together, please feel free to put that forth now as well. All right. Any questions, further comments, going once? Going twice? All right, looks like the group does not have any other questions or comments. So before we sign off, I just want to say thank you for spending some time with us this morning. Again, I encourage you to continue thinking about what was discussed this morning and to share any feedback that you have later on with me. And before we sign off, I will turn it back over to Bill for any closing comments.
Mike, thank you once again. Great town hall. I encourage anyone who is attending here today, if there's any input you'd like to provide, please reach out to Mike. He is going to be the conservator of all the information. We're going to continue to maintain open dialogue and ensure that the best decisions that we make are in the best interest for all our members. So I want to thank everybody once again for participating. I want everybody to stay safe, be well, enjoy your families. I want to once again thank our executive board for their tremendous support, in making sure that we are unified, and it's great to see everybody here once again. I guess one final call. Does anybody have anything to say? I see a couple people popping on. Okay. All right. Very good. So anyway, folks, thank you so very much and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
too.
Take care, everyone.
Bye now.
Bye.